Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of, for the first time, the Nikon Z or Z mount version of the Viltrox AF 16mm F1.8. This is the first of the reviews I've done on my new Nikon Z8 body. I've been enjoying getting to become familiar with it and start to do some lens reviews on it. Now, as the Nikon Z mount platform has begun to open up, it has become much more interesting to someone like myself. The Viltrox AF 16mm F1.8 it quickly became one of my favorite E-mount wide-angle prime lenses when it was released about a year ago. And so today's review not only explores how well it makes that transition to Nikon Z mount, but also the fact that Viltrox has managed in their fashion to add even more innovation in this transition. And we'll explore that as a part of today's review right after a word from our sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by the Fantom Duffel, a new unique convertible duffel bag that starts as a compact packable case that easily fits into your luggage or carry-on bag, but then converts into a 35-liter duffel. The exterior is made of 1680D ballistic nylon, which is tough and weatherproof. The interior has a high-visibility reflective finish that allows you to easily see what's inside, even in a dim hotel room. A large foam pouch on the side has a cable pass-through to allow for charging, and the removable straps use a fidlock system to easily and securely connect them. I've been using it for the gym, and it has room for my water bottle, a change of clothes, a basketball, my massive shoes, a towel, and a charger for my cell phone. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check it out and use code DUSTIN20 for 20% off when you're ready to check out. Now, to start off, things look very similar here on the exterior. There is a very slightly different lens profile, as you can see from this photo, that is due to the fact that the Z mount is significantly larger in diameter than what Sony's E mount is. And so that means that while there's a bit of a taper here on the E mount version, the lens stays a little bit wider at that point. Now, because that's not the widest point on the lens, the overall diameter of the lens actually stays the same. It's 85.2 millimeters in diameter, or 3.35 inches. The length, however, is just a little bit longer to accommodate for the difference in the flange distance between the two mounts. And so the Nikon Z mount version is 105 millimeters or 4.13 inches in length. So that adds about 4 millimeters to the overall length. And because it is just a little bit larger, it weighs just a little bit more. It's 565 grams or 19.4 ounces. So it's gained 15 grams in this transition. Now, while this isn't a small lens, it's what I would call a medium-sized lens. It obviously feels maybe a little bit more natural a fit here on a very beefy body like the Nikon Z8 body, as opposed to some of the smaller either Nikon bodies or going back to some of the Sony E-mount versions. So your tolerance for that may vary somewhat. I noted from the user reviews over the past year for the Sony version that there are some people that objected to the weight. Others thought that the quality of the lens certainly made up for that. I tend to be more in the latter case, but I do understand the reserves from the former. So you're going to have to make a decision for yourself whether or not that is a fit for you. I will note that the lens is fairly close, not quite identical, but very, very close in size and weight to the Nikon 20mm f1.8s lens. And so there really isn't necessarily smaller, lighter options when you're talking about this kind of focal length, and certainly not if you want that larger maximum aperture. Now, this lens is at a whole new level for features, even compared to a lot of the first-party lenses here on Z mount. It has a lot going on for it, and they've managed to add an additional feature that we didn't see on the E mount version before. So first of all, when it comes to the aperture iris here, we have some variety of ways to approach that. We have an aperture ring that allows you to choose with 1/3 stop detents. You can go past a hard stop into the A mode and go into automatic, but the lens also has a declick option on the side, and so if you click that, you now can smoothly rack through the whole aperture there, and so that gives you some additional options for doing aperture racking, kind of your control of aperture. So that is obviously very welcome. There is an AF/MF switch, which again is always welcome to me. And then there are actually two custom function buttons on the side. Now, the first top function number 1 button is going to work through whatever you've assigned to custom button functions in your actual camera body. And so obviously that's going to be useful for whatever function you have applied. The second function button is designed around the top mounted LCD screen. And that LCD screen allows you to do something like setting up, say, A/B focus, to where you choose one focus point and then a second focus point, and with the touch of that button you can rack between those two different focus points, which is obviously going to be very useful in certain kinds of application. Now, that LCD screen on the top, some people consider it to be a gimmick, others consider it to be useful. You'll have to determine for yourself where you fall in that particular debate. But what it does give you is a few bits of information on there. First of all, it provides the kind of old-fashioned distance scale. And that is where probably the chief objection is, and that some people feel like the distance scale information is not always accurate. And so, how important distance scale is to you is your mileage is going to vary on that, obviously. But it will also give you information like the aperture, which, I have to debate how important that is, considering that the aperture ring is literally right next to it. And so that might be easier to see itself. But more importantly, it's going to give you your positions for presetting your A/B focus and the ability to interact with that screen, and so you can program that in a useful kind of way. So I think that there is useful applications for it, but the truth of the matter is, much like the Zeiss Batis lenses that I've reviewed in the past, this probably isn't a deal breaker kind of feature, but it can be useful, and it seems to be a feature that Viltrox is going to embrace on some of their higher end lenses like the upcoming Lab series. Now, beyond that, we have a weather sealing gasket, and this is a professional grade of weather sealing. You can see from this diagram there are 12 different seal points, gaskets throughout the lens itself, plus a coating on the front element to help with fingerprints and also with moisture there. We do have a metal manual focus ring. In this case, I did notice that the focus throw was longer on the Z-mount version. There's a little bit more than 360 degrees of rotation there. I do find that the distance scale here, one useful thing for it is it does allow for a little bit more repeatable focus pulls, if that's a priority to you. And I will also note that just on a basic level versus the Sony E-mount version, Nikon's implementation of manual focus is preferable to me. There's a little bit more going on there, and so I really appreciate that, some of the manual focus aids that are there. And so I did enjoy the manual focus experience a little bit more on Z-mount than what I did on Sony E-mount. The lens has a USB-C port on the actual lens mount, which has become pretty ubiquitous for them. But what is new here is that they've actually added a Bluetooth module into the lens itself. And so there is a new Viltrox lens app that will allow you to do direct firmware updates right now, do firmware updates to the lens itself. And so that becomes probably the simplest means of doing firmware updates, even though they still have the USB-C port as another option. Now, the promise is they're going to add more function through this app in the future, and so it'll be interesting to see where all they go with that. But even on the basic level, this is probably going to be your easiest way to do firmware updates in the future, so something certainly worth checking out. But I can see them, you being able to do, say, your A/B focus programming and then pulls remotely, which could be a very interesting application to make sure that you're not introducing any kind of vibration into your shot. Again, that's conjecture, but we'll see where they go with that. Up front, we have a 77mm front filter thread. Very important in a wide angle, wide aperture lens like this, that you can use traditional circular filters on there. And it's one of the features that I praised on the E-mount version of the lens. Really glad to see that as a part of this design. The lens hood is included, as is a lens pouch. The lens pouch itself doesn't give you a lot of protection value. The lens hood itself is just okay. And the biggest reason, my biggest complaint about it is that it doesn't always lock in place here. When it's in position, it doesn't lock the way that you would like. And so it is possible for it to get bumped. I noticed, for example, I had a few shots that were ruined because I had taken it out of my camera bag. It obviously bumped in that transition and I hadn't noticed it. And so it was just a little bit off kilter, but even a little off kilter will introduce some mechanical vignette in the corners. And so it's something you're going to have to watch out for. And it's an area that I would like to see improvement from Viltrox, either adding a lock or adding a better just kind of locking mechanism when it gets into that final bayonet position. Overall, however, though, it's really hard to complain over a lens that cost $550, and if you use discount codes, you can get it closer to $500. This is a ton of lens for the money and a huge value proposition. Now, on the autofocus side of things, obviously that is another area where I was really interested in seeing how the lens performed as I'm becoming more familiar with Nikon's focus system here. Really interested to see how it compared to the Sony side of things. So, focus motor remains the same. This is a lead screw type STM focus motor. It is extremely quiet in operation, so you're not going to have any kind of issue with focus sound. I also noted that focus changes are very fast. Now, of course, wide-angle lenses are a little bit easier on that metric for the simple reason that there's a bigger depth of field, thus fewer focus possibilities. So they do tend to focus a little bit faster, but this is noticeably fast. Even indoors, I found that focus changes were pretty close to instantaneous. Outdoors, obviously even more so in better light. I also found that there was very good focus accuracy. Focus locked on my subject. It delivered, well-focused, well-detailed results. I will note that, and it seems to be a trend across multiple lenses I'm currently reviewing, and that is that sometimes when you have a close focus subject, the camera lens tends to prefer to focus on the background subject rather than the foreground subject. And so you sometimes have to, play with it a little bit, either focusing, down towards your feet, something nearby to get focus in the right zone, and then it will lock on that foreground subject better. But that does tend to be kind of maybe a vulnerability in the focus system itself on this Z8 camera, and maybe less lens specific since it seems to be doing the same thing on all three lenses that I'm currently testing. Now, one of the key improvements here on Nikon version, it's kind of ironic at this point. Sony has developed a well-deserved reputation for being a little bit more open sourced in terms of its focus algorithms. They have not prevented third-party development on their platform, and as a result, there are more Sony E-mount lenses in total, I think, probably than any platform ever in the history of photography. So kudos to them on that front. However, on the upper end of things, there's been some imposed limitations that have come from Sony, namely when it comes to a lens like this, is that you get a maximum burst rate of 15 frames per second with any non-Sony lens. So obviously that applied to this lens, even with something like my Sony Alpha 1, which can shoot at 30 frames per second. This Z8 can also shoot at 30 frames per second, but although Nikon was slow to open up the Z-mount protocols, they've also not imposed the same kind of limitations. So as a byproduct, I can shoot at 30 frames per second with this Viltrox lens, the first time I've been able to do so. And I found that autofocus could keep up. I shot a number of sequences here where I had my son kind of run and jump off a wall as I was at a lower angle just to see how it tracked his face during that rapid movement. And it seemed to do a very effective job. And I was able to get that in just a little over a second, that whole sequence. It's actually a little under a second. I had about 29 shots in a little under a second. So it shows that I'm getting the full burst rate out of that, which is fantastic, obviously, for Z-mount shooters. Now, on the video side of things, I found that focus was also very good. Focus pulls are well damped. They're smooth and confident. There's no settling or pulsing or anything like that. It's not like super fast, but it's controlled, it's damped in between those 2 points. Though, of course, you can, through the actual tuning in the camera body, you could turn that speed up if you so desired. But for this purpose, I was satisfied with what I saw there. It was a little bit more of a detriment at the more standard focus speeds when I was doing my hand transition, because it's not as reactive as what I would like. So again, if you're in a more reactive setting, you may need to turn that up to get your most effective focus results. But what I did find is that tuning for real-world shots, where I'm transitioning from one focus point to another, it does tend to be a little bit more cinematic in the process, so there's nothing jarring. And the fact that focus breathing is quite low on the lens is a benefit as well. It means that you're going to get very cinematic looking focus pulls and focus transitions while shooting video. So that is obviously fantastic. Making this, even though it's heavy, makes it a good gimbal lens, great focal length, obviously, for wide angle shots. And the distortion's a little bit complex, as we'll see in just a moment, but it's also extremely minimal. So this is not a bad idea for if you're looking for something for doing interior shots. If you're doing maybe for real estate photography and you want to do walkthroughs or something similar, not a bad option here. Nice wide angle of view, not so wide that things look weird, however, and fairly low distortion. So kudos to Viltrox. This is a useful lens for video work on a variety of fronts. So finally, let's talk about image quality, and obviously these are the same optics as what we saw before, but I'll just kind of examine how they play out on a different kind of camera system. We will do a detailed optical breakdown at the end of the review if you're interested in that, but I'll give you an overview here if you want to get in and out quicker. One thing is definitely noticeable is in more recent Viltrox lenses, going back a little over a year ago, is that the optical glass was improved. I understand that there is a partnership with Hoya and that has improved their optical glass, and it is improved. I really like the colors I see off the lens now, and they are noticeably improved. The lens continues to have the benefit of having low chromatic aberrations, both of the longitudinal and lateral type. There is, as noted, some minor distortion. So the distortion itself is minor, but it is non-linear. And so manually correcting it is not easy. Now there is a profile in software that will allow you to correct that. And I believe it will correct somewhat in camera. However, I will note that on the vignette side of things, it corrects a little bit of vignette, but certainly not a sufficient amount. Now on the vignette side of things, I did see just a little bit more vignette on Z mount than what I saw on Sony E mount. Not a huge amount, but maybe an additional around plus 10 to correct for. In this case, I'm all the way up to over 90 in trying to correct for it. So we're approaching over 3 stops in terms of shading in the corner. Definitely noticeable. And as noted, the correction profile in camera does not fully deal with that. And so I think you're probably going to want to do some post-processing. Now on the sharpness side of things, there's great sharpness at f1.8. In the center of the frame, good sharpness in mid-frame, and good sharpness in corner, but there is a much noticeable improvement in the mid-frame and the corners, not at f2, but at f2.8. And from there on through f8, you have fantastic sharpness all across the frame. You'll start to see some diffraction at f11, though 45 megapixels is not, terribly high as far as resolution these days, and so it's not bad at f11, but will be much more noticeable at f16 and f22, which is minimum aperture that will be softening due to the effects of diffraction. The bokeh quality here is not bad. You can get reasonably soft backgrounds, but it is limited by the fact that this lens has a quite low minimum focus distance of 27 centimeters and a maximum magnification of only 0.10 times. So you can't get particularly close to anything, thus don't expect your backgrounds to be strongly blurred out. As a byproduct, bokeh is probably not your chief concern with this lens, but it is okay. There's a little bit of outlining sometimes in specular highlights, but again, it looks pretty decent overall. I found that flare varied a little bit depending on the aperture value. And so I think the lens is actually fairly good at large apertures. As you stop the lens down, the flare patterns become a little bit more defined. And so you're going to have to compose accordingly. And so we'll call it a mixed result when it comes to flare. I did note also if the sun was just a little outside of the frame, you could get some shafts of light coming in. Nothing too distracting, however. I also found that coma performance is fairly good with this lens. And so obviously it's going to be a very attractive night sky lens. Again, large maximum aperture for a wide angle lens, great wide angle of view. There's not really much like this on Z mount currently. And so this could be a really appealing astro lens, particularly considering that it is very reasonable in price. And that brings us to our conclusion. I really think that this lens fills a hole in the Nikkor lineup. Sony obviously has had a ton of lenses, and even there I found this to be a very useful lens. On Z mount, I think it's going to be even more useful because that focal length is going to be covered by some zoom lenses, but not really by prime lenses with maximum aperture as large as this. You add that to the fact that this lens is incredible value for the money. As noted before, if you use the code Dustin Abbott at the Viltrox store, you can get this lens for right over $500. And that is an incredible value when you consider that, say again, the Nikkor 20mm F1.8S is basically double that. If you're going to talk about a zoom that's going to cover this focal length, you're going to pay even more. And so if you shoot wide angle infrequently or it's not your primary, obviously this is a relatively small investment to get a very high quality, high performing, feature rich lens. And I think that this lens, it's been a fantastic seller on Sony. I expect it to be no less on Nikon as well. If you want more information, I do have a whole new review from the Nikon perspective of things that you can find linked in the description down below. There's some buying links there as well. And if you want a deeper dive into the optical performance, let's jump into it right now together. So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion here. You can see on the left side an uncorrected raw image. There is only a very minor amount of barrel distortion that is there. You can see, however, though, it's not necessarily easy to correct for, because what happens is that because it's not linear, if you try to correct for it, the center kind of pulls into a pincushion distortion. And so, I mean, there's really no easy way to correct for it manually because it is non-linear. At the same time, however, most of the time you could get away with just not even correcting it and probably not notice very much. Vignette, on the other hand, is quite heavy. You can see here that it's strong in the corners. This is a plus 91 to correct, and you can see I could probably go all the way up to the maximum of 100. So there's a lot of vignette there to deal with. Now, longitudinal chromatic aberrations are very well controlled. You can see, taking a look here at these plum tree blossoms, very high contrast in the edges of these. You can see that fringing, as we head out of focus, is just really well controlled. There's great detail on the subject, and you can see there's no fringing in the image. There is a little bit of lateral chromatic aberrations, and I've got this extremely magnified at this point, so it fills the frame. So this is well over 200%, more than what you're going to typically see. But you can see at this high level of magnification, there is a tiny bit of fringing there, but it is really minimal. So how about a look at resolution and contrast? This is 200% magnification on the 45 megapixels of the Nikon Z8. So in the center of the frame, you can see just fantastic. There's a fair bit of moire there due to not having that low pass filter. And so as a byproduct, sharpness though looks great. If we move towards the mid frame, you can see that it isn't as amazing as it was in the center. This still looks very good, just a little bit less so when we get to this point. Likewise here, again, you could see a little bit of drop off from here to here. We move down to the corners. There's still a decent amount of detail there. You can see that all throughout, it's just contrast really isn't as good. In that sweet spot, though, of the center 2/3, sharpness is just amazing. And you can see here, even going deeply cropped into this, that the detail is just fantastic. Very fine rendering of all of those little details, so I'm very impressed with that. Stopping down to f2 gives a very minor contrast boost. You can see that the darks are a little bit deeper here in the center of the frame. It's not enough to cause a significant improvement to the mid frame or the corners yet. But if you stop on down from f2 to f2.8, you can see a significant improvement in the corners, more detail, better contrast, and then obviously some brightening as the effects of the vignette are starting to lift. From f2.8 to f4, you see an even more significant boost to the contrast in the corners, which are now looking very crisp. And by f5.6, they are tack sharp. I mean, just really great detail. So that means your landscape images are going to be sharp all across the frame. Now, in the center of the frame, you can see that the sharpness peaks here at f5.6. f8 is just very slightly less sharp and contrasty. In the corners, it looks roughly the same. We've got a nice even performance. By f11, diffraction is starting to show up just a little bit, and so it's a little softer. And by the time you hit the minimum aperture of f22, you can see that diffraction has severely softened the image. Coming back to f5.6 for a moment, we've already looked at this corner. I'm going to look over here at the other side now. It looks about equally sharp. Upper left corner looking very, very sharp, and then upper right corner, and we can see looking good here as well. So we've got a nice centering here as well. Now, as noted, maximum magnification is not fantastic, 0.10 times. Contrast and detail look pretty decent up close, so at least it is fairly strong on that point.
So as a byproduct of not being able to get particularly close, it's going to be rare that you can strongly blur out a background, but we'll take a quick look at bokeh here just in case. You can see that there definitely is a little bit of outlining, almost like a bubble effect on some of the specular highlights. Either you like that or you don't, but you can see that there's good detail on the subject, and then the background itself is reasonably soft other than that outlining. Again, there's just not going to be a lot of situations to create this. As noted, the colors in Viltrox lenses have really improved, and you can see here at a landscape aperture that there's just good detail everywhere we look in the frame. Definitely one of the advantages of a wide-angle lens like this is the ability to get so much in focus at the same time. One more shot here, and again, if we punch in to look at the details here in the image, it looks beautiful. Colors are very nice, and then we can see even coming back here to the rocks, even though focus is out here, a lot of this is still in focus, and it's only till you get to the very front here where things are less in focus. Here's another image that shows nice color. It also shows a nice sunburst effect from the 9 aperture blades. Now, shooting wide open, you can see that there's a little bit of a glow effect, a little tiny bit of ghosting artifact, nothing that's too destructive here. We stop on down and that flare pattern becomes more pronounced. You get some of this kind of prismatic effect around the blades. Again, it's still not terrible. It's not really all that destructive to the image. And as noted previously in our summation, you can see that the sun is right outside the frame. You will get some of these kind of shafts of light coming into the frame. That is an optical defect, obviously, but it's not a terribly destructive one. So finally, let's take a look at coma. Now, this night was supposed to be perfectly clear. You can see that the weatherman didn't get it perfect. Little clouds came in, but we can still see the stars behind them. So in the center of the frame, even at f1.8, really nice and clean. No problems there. We look off towards the edge of the frame. There is a little bit of coma smear. You can see, however, that it's not severe in any way, shape, or form. And so this is a perfectly useful lens for shooting the night sky, and really a pretty good result overall.
So hopefully a deep dive into the optics has given you a better sense whether or not this is the lens for you. As always, thanks for watching all the way to the end. Have a great day, and let the light in.